Today, I want to look at one of the most famous stories in the Bible, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's a story almost everyone thinks they know. God creates Adam, God places him in the garden, Eve is created, the serpent appears, the forbidden fruit is eaten. Their eyes are opened, they realize they are naked, they hide from God, they are questioned, and they are expelled from Eden. In the common religious imagination, this is the story of the fall. Human beings were innocent, then they sinned. They disobeyed God and paradise was lost. But Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst and social philosopher, reads the story differently. For Fromm, Adam and Eve are not simply the first sinners, they are the first human beings to become conscious of themselves. Their disobedience is not merely a fall downward, it is also a birth upward, painful, dangerous, tragic, but necessary. Fromm's reading is not orthodox in the conventional sense. He is not trying to defend doctrine. He is interested in freedom, human development, alienation, and moral responsibility. And when he turns to the Bible, especially in his book, You Shall Be as Gods, he sees something radical. A religious tradition that is not simply about submission to authority, but about humanity growing towards freedom, reason, love, and responsibility. That makes his reading of Eden especially powerful, because he asks us to imagine the garden not only as a paradise, but as childhood. In the garden, Adam and Eve are innocent. They don't know their own shame. They don't yet know good and evil. They live in unity with nature, with one another, and with God. There was no separation, no conflict, no self consciousness. But there was also no freedom. That is Fromm's key point. Innocence is not the same as maturity. A baby is innocent, but not yet moral. A child may be protected, but not yet free. Adam and Eve in Eden are safe, but they are not yet fully human in the psychological sense. They have not yet chosen. They have not separated. They have not become conscious of themselves as independent beings. Then comes the commandment of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. The commandment creates the possibility of freedom. Without prohibition, there is no choice. Without choice, there is no obedience. Without the possibility of disobedience, there is no moral life. This is psychologically profound. A parent may say to a child, don't touch this, or do not cross that road, or don't open that door. At first, the command protects the child, but eventually the child must become capable of choosing and not merely obeying. The child must internalize wisdom. The child must separate from the parents. Human development requires a break. And in Fromm's reading, Adam and Eve's eating from the tree represents precisely that break. They become aware. Their eyes are opened. They realize they are naked. Now, this is usually read as shame, and it is shame, but it is also self consciousness. They are no longer simply immersed in nature. They now see themselves from the outside. They know themselves as separate beings. This is the beginning of human consciousness, and consciousness is painful. The animal doesn't worry about being naked. The animal does not ask, who am I? The animal does not feel existential loneliness. The animal does not wonder whether it is loved, whether it is guilty, or whether it will die. The human being does. So when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, they enter the human condition. They gain knowledge but lose innocence. They gain freedom but lose security. They gain selfhood but lose seamless unity. They are born as human beings and the birth hurts. This is why Fromm's reading is so compelling. He does not sentimentalize paradise. He recognizes that paradise may be beautiful, but it is also pre-human. It is a state before freedom, before moral responsibility, before individuality. The expulsion from Eden is therefore tragic, but also necessary. No one can remain in the womb forever. No one can remain a child forever. No one can become fully human without leaving the garden. Now, this does not mean that disobedience is always good. Fromm is not saying that rebellion for its own sake is virtue. He is saying something more subtle. The first act of freedom often appears as disobedience because the individual must separate from authority in order to become responsible. This is true psychologically. A child who never says no may not be virtuous, they may simply be afraid. A person who obeys every authority without reflection may be orderly but not mature. Moral adulthood begins when one can distinguish between obedience to truth and obedience to power. That distinction matters throughout the Bible. Abraham argues with God over Sodom. Moses argues with God after the golden calf. The prophets confront kings. Job refuses false guilt. The Hebrew Bible is full of people who stand before authority and speak. So Fromm sees biblical religion as anti-idolatrous in the deepest sense. Idolatry is not only bowing to statues, it is surrendering one's living human powers to something dead, external, and controlling. An idol can be a golden calf, but it can also be a nation, a leader, money, success, public approval, a religious institution, a psychological need for certainty. Even a false image of God can become an idol. Fromm's great concern is that human beings escape from freedom by submitting to idols. Freedom is frightening. Responsibility is heavy. So we look for someone or something to tell us what to do, who to be, who to hate, or what to worship. Eden is therefore not just an ancient story, it is a permanent temptation. Part of us wants to go back to innocence, back to certainty, back to childhood, back to a world where someone else decides. But the way back to Eden is closed. The flaming sword guards the entrance. Human beings cannot return to unconscious innocence. We can only go forward through history, through suffering, through love, through responsibility toward a more mature unity. This is a very important idea in Fromm. He distinguishes between two kinds of unity. The first is the unity before separation, the infant with the mother, Adam and Eve in Eden, the human being immersed in nature. It is safe but unconscious. The second is the unity after separation, mature love, ethical responsibility, conscious solidarity, freely chosen relationship with others and with God. The goal is not to return to Eden. The goal is to create a new form of unity beyond Eden. That is a beautiful idea. It means that the human journey is not simply a story of loss, it is a story of becoming. We lose innocence, but we gain wisdom. We lose childish dependence, but we gain mature love. We lose paradise, but we may gain personhood. Now let's look more closely at the figures in the story. Adam is passive in many readings. Eve speaks with the serpent, considers the fruit, eats, and gives to Adam. Adam also eats, but when God questions him, he shifts blame. The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave of me the tree, and I ate. This is psychologically revealing. The first response to guilt is often evasion. Adam blames Eve and indirectly blames God, the woman whom you gave me. Eve blames the serpent. No one immediately says, I chose. That is a very human moment. The birth of consciousness includes the birth of responsibility, but responsibility is painful. We try to escape it. We blame the partner, the parent, the system, the serpent, the circumstances. We say, it was not really me. But maturity begins when we can say, I acted. not with crushing shame, but with truth. Fromm's humanism depends on this. Freedom is not the absence of limits. Freedom is the capacity to act consciously and take responsibility for one's actions. That is very different from childish freedom, which says, I can do whatever I want. Mature freedom says, I am answerable for what I become. The serpent is also psychologically fascinating. In many traditional readings, the serpent is the tempter, the deceiver, the voice of evil. But symbolically, the serpent is more ambiguous. It is earthy, instinctive, cunning, and alive. It belongs to nature. It raises the question that authority is left closed. Did God really say that? That question is dangerous, but it is also the beginning of reflection. Every tradition depends on obedience at some stage, but every mature tradition also has to allow questioning. Without questioning, faith becomes fear. Without questioning, obedience never becomes understanding. The serpent's question opens the space of interpretation. Again, it does not mean that the serpent is simply good. The serpent manipulates, the serpent distorts, but psychologically, temptation often comes mixed with truth. The most dangerous temptations are not pure lies. They contain a fragment of truth used destructively. The serpent says their eyes will be opened, and they are opened. But the serpent does not tell them how painful that opening will be. That too is psychologically true. Every step into consciousness costs more than we expect. When a person becomes aware of a family pattern, a personal weakness, a hidden resentment, or a truth about their life, the first experience is often not liberation but pain. Consciousness hurts before it heals. Adam and Eve hide. That's the next great symbol. Once self-consciousness appears, hiding appears. Before the fruit, there is no shame and no concealment. After the fruit, they cover themselves and hide among the trees. This is the birth of the divided self, the self that is seen and the self that hides, the self we present and the self we fear is unacceptable, the self that wants to be known and the self that fears exposure. Psychoanalysis begins in precisely this territory. What are we hiding? From whom and why? Why do we fear would happen if we were seen as we are? And then God asks, where are you? This is one of the most psychologically profound questions in the Bible. Of course, on a simple theological level, God knows where they are. The question is not for God's information, it is for Adam. Where are you? Where are you now after this choice? Where are you in relation to me? Where are you in relation to yourself? Where are you hiding? Every person can hear that question. Where are you? Not geographically, but existentially. Where are you in your life? Where are you in your truth? Where are you in your responsibility? Where are you hiding from the voice that calls you? Fromm would say that the human being is born when he or she can answer that question consciously, not by returning to childish innocence, not by denying the act, not by hiding, but by standing in freedom. Now, what about God in this story? In a simple authoritarian reading, God commands, humans disobey, God punishes. But Fromm's reading invites us to see something more developmental. God does not destroy Adam and Eve. He clothes them. He sends them out into a difficult world, but he does not abandon them. This is significant. The expulsion is painful, but it is also the beginning of history. Outside Eden, human beings work, love, suffer, give birth, build, murder, repent, wander, and call upon God. The Bible as we know it begins after Eden. The real human story begins outside of paradise. That is where we live. We do not live in Eden. We live east of Eden. We live in the world of work, mortality, desire, shame, conflict, and responsibility. And yet, from a biblical point of view, God continues to speak there. That is perhaps the great answer to the despair of the fall. The garden is lost, but relationship is not lost. The world is broken, but not abandoned. Humanity is wounded, but still addressed. Fromm's reading, therefore, gives us a way to understand Eden without reducing it to either childish guilt or sentimental nostalgia. It is not simply humanity was good, then became bad. It is more like humanity was unconscious, then became free. The freedom brought tragedy, responsibility, and possibility. Now, a traditional religious listener may object. Does this not excuse sin? Does it not turn disobedience into progress? This is a fair objection. Fromm's reading can seem to soften the seriousness of rebellion against God. It can sound as though the commandment was merely a psychological obstacle to be overcome, but that may not be the best way to hear him. Fromm is not saying that there is no such thing as sin. He is saying that human growth involves risk, separation, and the burden of choice. Sin and consciousness are intertwined because only a conscious being can sin. A stone cannot sin. An animal cannot sin in the moral sense. Only a free being can. So the story of Eden is not less serious in Fromm's reading. It is more serious. It says that to be human is to be capable of disobedience, shame, blame, hiding, and also growth. It says that freedom is not clean. It says that moral life begins in ambiguity. This is why Adam and Eve remain so powerful. They are not remote mythic ancestors. They are us. We eat what we should not eat. We want knowledge without cost. We blame others. We hide. We hear the question, "Where are you?" and we struggle to answer. Fromm helps us see that the Bible is not merely telling us how humanity fell, it is telling us how humanity began. The birth of the human being is the loss of innocence. That is true in every individual life. A child grows up and discovers that the parents are flawed. The world is dangerous. Love is complicated. Death is real, and choices have consequences. That discovery is painful, but without it, there is no adulthood. So perhaps the Garden of Eden is not simply behind us. Perhaps it is the childhood we all must leave. And perhaps the real spiritual task is not to sneak back into the garden, but to move forward towards a more conscious form of love. A love that knows separation, a faith that has passed through questioning, an obedience that is freely chosen, a unity that does not depend on ignorance. In that sense, Fromm gives us one of the most humane readings of Eden. He allows us to mourn the loss of paradise, but not to worship immaturity. He allows us to take sin seriously, but not to hate human freedom. He allows us to see disobedience as dangerous, but also to see that without the capacity to disobey, obedience itself has no moral meaning. So the question of Eden becomes very personal. Where in our lives are we still trying to return to childish certainty? Where are we hiding from responsibility? Where do we prefer innocence to truth? Where do we obey only because we are afraid? Where do we rebel only because we cannot bear dependence? And where is the voice still asking, "Where are you?" That question may be the beginning of the spiritual life, not the answer, the question, "Where are you?" Adam and Eve answer poorly at first. So do we. But the fact that the question is asked means that relationship continues. The garden is gone. The road is hard. The human being is divided, ashamed, and immortal. But the voice of God still seeks the human being. And in Fromm's reading, that is where real humanity begins. not in paradise, but in the difficult freedom outside it.